mother always said that no matter how bad something was, it really didn't matter as long as you got a good story out of it, because everything works together for good. And I remember when I was 20, in my early 20s, living in Austin, Texas, and I really had cause to think about that. It was the night before I was going to fly back to Spain. My parents had moved from England to Spain, and I hadn't seen them for a year, and I really missed them. I particularly missed my mother. I couldn't wait to see her. Well, the young man I'd been seeing him for about 8 months, he came round to take me out for dinner, and he brought with him this huge present. It was enormous. It was all beautifully wrapped, and it had a big bow on top of it. And I said, well, thank you, how lovely, how unexpected. How wonderful to get a goodbye gift. And he said, don't open it just yet. He said, wait till we come back from dinner. And so that's what happened. He took me out to dinner, and then I opened this present, and I ripped off the paper, and it was the most beautiful suitcase. It was an absolutely stunning thing. It was top of the line. It really was a work of art. It was suede and tapestry, and I absolutely loved it. And I said, darling, how gorgeous of you. I'm so grateful. What a lovely goodbye present. I'll take it to Spain with me tomorrow. And he said, Geraldine, that's it. It is a goodbye present. I want to break off this relationship. Goodbye. And he left the apartment and he left my life. And as I watched his headlights going down the hill, I thought to myself, well, I hope my mother's right, and I hope I get a good story out of this, and somehow maybe good will come from it. 2 hours later, I felt very queasy. And I thought, I liked the man, but I didn't think I was going to have a physical reaction to breaking up with him. But a couple more hours, and I realized that this had nothing to do with breaking up with the man, except perhaps the dinner he had fed me, because I clearly had eaten something like a bad shrimp, and I was sick. I had a case of food poisoning that worked its way through and exploded out both ends of my system. I'm sure you get my drift. And all night, between spending long bouts in the restroom and trying to pack this suitcase, I thought, that's why he gave me the suitcase. He wanted to make sure I left the country, that there was no impediment to me going. I will get a good story out of this one day. Well, the next day I had 4 flights. And the first one was from Austin to Houston. Well, I threw up and more all the way. From Houston to New York, a very kind air hostess, she took one look at me and she said, come with me, dear. And she sat me in a seat that was much closer to the restroom, which was a really good thing because I wore a track in the carpet. And then the next flight was from New York to Madrid. Well, there was a long layover, and I had to get from the terminal I'd arrived in to the international terminal. And I zigzagged my way to the international terminal because I went from restroom to restroom. And I became personally acquainted with a large percentage of the porcelain in JFK. I was so grateful to get on that next flight. The next flight was from New York to Madrid. I was so sick. I felt dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. I had a fever. I couldn't keep anything down. Anything I put in me, food or liquid, just exploded out of me. Everything in me ached. And by the time I got to Madrid, I was sicker than I'd ever been in my life. I had bloodshot eyes. I knew that my hair looked like seaweed that had been electrified. I was pale, and yet I was green around the gills. However I managed those two, I have no idea. But I think I've told you, so sick. But I just had one more flight I had to get from Madrid to Malaga, and then I would see my mother. And at that point, my whole focus was, I want my mama. I want my mama. The whole idea of I'll get a good story out of this was drowned by that internal voice of, just give me my mama. I transformed from being an independent career woman to a child. Just give me my mother. But the only thing in between me and seeing my mother was the customs officer. And I knew I was going to have to really move because that international flight had been delayed and it was a short turnover. So I just had to get my passport stamped, find a restroom, and then get on the next plane. So I presented my passport and it was stamped. And then a voice said, "Un momento, señorito, un momento, por favor." And I turned around and there was a Guardia Civil. He was in his sludgy green uniform and his big boots, black boots, highly polished. Now, I knew this man was the only thing that was standing between me and me seeing my mother. And he let out this long stream of Spanish, and I didn't understand it. My Spanish was very, very bad. On a very good day, I was like an enthusiastic, but not very bright 7-year-old. So I didn't understand what he said, but I said in my best Spanish, which of course was not that good, "Sir, please let me go. I need to catch another flight. And if you don't let me go, I'm in danger of throwing up on your boots." Well, at least that's what I thought I said. But his face changed, it got really hard, and his whole body stiffened, and I thought, what have I said? Have I just insulted his grandmother? Or worse, have I inadvertently said something like, "Sir, I have drugs. Would you like to buy some?" The reaction was enormous. He just pointed and he started screaming in this machine gun Spanish, and he pointed at this door, and out of nowhere, this huge woman, she appeared. She was a cross between Attila the Hun and Hulk Hogan in drag. And she grabbed my arm and she said in broken English, which was probably much better than my Spanish, "Come with me, we go for a street search." Street search. And she took me into this small interrogation chamber. Well, this was the early 80s, and Franco had not been dead long, and there was a huge fear about the Guardia Civil in Spain at that time. And in fact, many people were interviewed and not all of them returned. And as I went into this interrogation chamber, I thought, am I ever going to get out of here? Will I ever see my mother? Well, I had to take off all my clothing, every stitch. And I won't go into the rest of it, I will leave it to your very vivid imaginations. But put it this way, every orifice that I possessed was thoroughly examined. Now, I was in that zone. You know, there's a zone that when you're really, really ill, you don't care who looks at what, you just want to get better. Well, I was in that kind of zone, but it was still horrible. It was still humiliating. And of course, I missed my flight. It was another 5 hours before I could get a flight and eventually see my mother. And in that time, I thought, I don't want a story out of this. I don't believe that any good will ever come out of this. I just want this whole incident put in the very back of my subconscious. I don't want to think about it. And that's where that story stayed for over 2.5 decades. And then I got a new job. I became the new Protestant chaplain at the largest men's prison in Maryland. There was a huge amount of men in there, but in my congregation, my core congregation, there was a core congregation of about 600 men. And they were former murderers, rapists. I had a bishop, and I had a politician. And I had a few of those men, 3 of those men to be exact, in my office one of the first days that I was the chaplain. And there were 2 older men, and there was a younger man, and this man was about 25. He had been incarcerated for 4 years on a 40-year sentence. And he was very indignant. He was small, he was wiry, he had tattoos all over his neck, and his whole neck pulsated, and so did the tattoos because he was so upset. And he said, "Chaplain, you could not possibly understand some of the indignities that we have to go through." He said, "You couldn't understand." He said, "Do you know that before we get to see our family in the waiting room," he said, "you realize that we have to be strip searched?" Now, I knew all about the squat and cough procedure, as the men called it. And he carried on. He said, "You could not understand." And slowly, out of my subconscious, pictures started to emerge. I remembered seeing black, shiny boots. I remembered seeing a female Attila the Hun, and I remembered my mother's words. It doesn't matter how bad something is, as long as you can get a good story out of it. All things work together for good. And I leaned back in my chair and I realized that this was the first bridge of many bridges that would be linked between me and these men with the power of story. And I smiled and I said, "Well, gentlemen, I think I might understand a little more than you would give credit for. Gentlemen, let me tell you a story."